two thugs in black hoodies corner an elderly woman on a crowded city bus. She's clutching her purse, trembling, as one grabs her wrist and the other blocks anyone from helping. The entire bus sits frozen. 23 people watching. 23 people doing nothing. Then a voice cuts through the silence. Calm? Commanding? Absolute. The thugs turn and see a man in Delta Force uniform, his German shepherd at his side, rising from his seat.
Please, man, don't
They
do
laugh,
this.
mock his dog.
We'll do
One
anything
pulls a
you
knife.
want. Just let
They think
us
the
go.
uniform is fake, think he's pretending.
Please.
But they made one fatal mistake. This wasn't pretend. He was the real thing. And in 60 seconds, these predators would learn what happens when you pick the wrong fight on the wrong bus. Before we begin, tell us wherever in the world you're watching from, because what you're about to witness will restore your faith in justice. The number 47 bus rolled through the heart of Pittsburgh's East End at exactly 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The light had that particular golden quality that comes just before autumn fully settles in, casting long shadows through the grimy windows and illuminating the dust motes that hung suspended in the stale air. The bus was about 2/3 full, carrying the usual assortment of people you'd find on public transit at that hour. Students with oversized backpacks and earbuds jammed in their ears, a couple of nurses in scrubs, their faces lined with the particular exhaustion that comes from a 12-hour shift. A construction worker still covered in drywall dust, his paint-splattered boots leaving white footprints on the black rubber floor. People going about their lives, existing in that peculiar urban bubble where you're surrounded by humanity, but completely alone. In the back third of the bus, occupying 2 seats near the rear exit, sat Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale. And here's the thing about Marcus. He wasn't trying to be inconspicuous. He couldn't be. He was wearing his full Delta Force uniform, the distinctive green military tactical camouflage that immediately identified him as something other than your average soldier. The Delta Force patch on his shoulder, the American flag positioned precisely above it, the various commendations and unit insignias that told a story to anyone who knew how to read them. The uniform wasn't for show. Marcus had spent the entire day at the Veterans Affairs Hospital downtown, visiting wounded soldiers, speaking at a ceremony honoring fallen members of his unit, shaking hands with families who'd lost sons and daughters in places whose names would never make the evening news. It had been a long day, a heavy day, the kind of day that reminded him why he did what he did, and simultaneously made him question whether any of it mattered. He'd chosen to take the bus back to his sister's house in Shadyside rather than accept the ride that had been offered. He needed the time, needed the normalcy of public transit, the anonymity of being just another person traveling through the city. Needed to not be Staff Sergeant Hale for 45 minutes. Just Marcus. Just a guy on a bus. Except he could never really be just a guy. Not with the uniform. Not with the training that had become so deeply embedded in his nervous system that he couldn't turn it off even if he wanted to. His eyes constantly scanned, constantly assessed, constantly measured distances and angles and potential threats. It wasn't paranoia, it was programming. 15 years of conditioning that had kept him alive in places where the difference between living and dying came down to noticing the wrong detail, the thing that didn't quite fit. Beside him, taking up the window seat, was Titan. And Titan was not a pet. Titan was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois, 80 pounds of muscle, intelligence, and absolute loyalty. He was a military working dog, trained in explosive detection, patrol work, and tactical operations. He'd served 2 deployments with. Marcus had saved his life in Kandahar when he'd detected an IED that would have taken out their entire squad, and had been by his side through things that neither of them would ever fully process. Titan wore a tactical vest that marked him as a working military dog, and he sat with the calm alertness that comes from being a professional at the top of his game. His ears were up, his dark eyes watching the other passengers with interest but no aggression. He'd been in the ceremony too, had worn his medal with the same dignity that Marcus wore his. Marcus ran his hand along Titan's back, feeling the familiar comfort of the dog's presence. In 3 more stops, they'd get off. Walk the 4 blocks to his sister Rachel's place. Maybe have dinner that didn't come from an MRE packet. Maybe sleep in a bed that didn't require him to keep his boots on and his rifle within arm's reach. Maybe for just one night, pretend that the world was the safe, predictable place that most of these people on this bus assumed it was. That's when he noticed her. 7 rows ahead, on the right side of the bus, sitting alone near the middle doors. An elderly woman, maybe mid-70s, with carefully curled white hair and a navy blue coat, despite the warmth of the afternoon. She carried a large brown leather purse in her lap, clutching it with both hands in that particular way that elderly people do when they're traveling through parts of the city that make them nervous. Her name was Dorothy Cassidy, though Marcus didn't know that yet. She'd spent the afternoon at her daughter's house in Garfield, helping watch her 3-year-old grandson, while her daughter worked a double shift at the call center. She was heading home to her small apartment in Bloomfield, the same apartment she'd lived in for 42 years, since before the neighborhood had changed, since before her husband had passed, since before her knees had started giving her trouble and made the bus the only practical way to get around. Dorothy's hands tightened on her purse as the bus slowed for the next stop. She'd seen them get on at the last stop. 2 young men, maybe early 20s, both wearing black hoodies despite the warmth, both wearing faded blue jeans that hung low on their hips. She'd seen the way they'd looked at her, the way they'd looked at everyone, actually, with that particular predatory assessment that made her stomach clench. She'd lived in this city her entire life. She knew trouble when she saw it. The 2 men moved with a casual purposefulness that set Marcus's internal alarms humming at a low frequency. They were both tall, both lean, both moving with that particular loose-limbed confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. The one in front had a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck from beneath his hoodie. The one behind had a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Marcus catalogued these details automatically, the same way he catalogued the fact that both of them kept their hands in their hoodie pockets, the same way he noted that they were moving through the bus in a coordinated pattern, one working up the left side, one up the right, like wolves circling. They weren't looking at phones, they weren't talking to each other, they were hunting. The one with the neck tattoo, his name was Trevor, though that detail didn't matter much. What mattered was that he'd spent the last 3 months working this exact bus route, him and his partner Curtis, the one with the scar. They had a system. Get on at the Negley Avenue stop, work the bus until Aiken, get off before the route turned toward the better neighborhoods where people were more likely to make a fuss. They targeted the elderly, the distracted, the isolated. Quick grabs, nothing violent if it could be avoided, just enough intimidation to freeze people up while they took wallets, phones, whatever looked valuable. They'd pulled it off 11 times in the last month alone. Not once had anyone intervened. Not once had anyone even looked up from their phones. Because that's how it works, isn't it? In a crowded space, everyone assumes someone else will do something. Everyone assumes it's not their problem. Everyone looks away. Trevor locked eyes with Dorothy. She felt her heart start racing, that flood of adrenaline that comes when prey recognizes a predator. She looked down at her purse, tried to make herself smaller, tried to become invisible, but it was too late. She'd been selected. Trevor moved into the empty seat beside her, cutting off her ability to slide towards the aisle. Curtis positioned himself standing in the aisle directly in front of her, blocking her from the view of most of the other passengers. It was smooth, practiced. They'd done this dance before. "Hey there, Grandma," Trevor said, his voice low and conversational, almost friendly. That's a nice purse you got there. Dorothy's hands tightened on the leather. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Please, I don't want any trouble. No trouble at all, Curtis said from his position in the aisle, his voice carrying that same false friendliness. Just thinking maybe you got something in that purse you don't really need. Maybe something you could share with some folks who ain't as fortunate as you. Marcus saw it happening, watched the subtle choreography of intimidation, the way they'd boxed her in, the way the other passengers were suddenly very interested in their phones, in the advertisements above the windows, in anything except what was happening 7 rows ahead. He felt Titan tense beside him. The dog had seen it too, had read the body language, had felt Marcus's own body shift in response to the threat assessment his brain was running. Here's what Marcus knew in that moment. He knew he was tired, knew he'd spent the entire day being a symbol, being a representative, being everything except just himself. Knew that intervening would mean paperwork, would mean police, reports, would mean his face in the news again, would mean his commanding officer getting a phone call, would mean complications that he didn't need. He knew all of that. He also knew that an elderly woman was being victimized 15 feet away from him while a bus full of people pretended not to notice. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Ma'am, Trevor was saying, his hand now on Dorothy's wrist, his grip firm enough to hurt without leaving immediate marks. I'm trying to be nice here, but you're making this difficult. Just give me the purse, and we can all go about our day. Dorothy's eyes were watering now, tears of fear and frustration and the bitter recognition that no one was going to help her. She could feel Curtis's presence blocking her in, could smell the cigarette smoke on his clothes. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold on to her purse, but she held on anyway, because that purse contained her late husband's wedding ring, the one she'd been taking to the jeweler to have resized for her grandson, and she'd be damned if she'd let these two take it without a fight. That's when the voice cut through the stale air of the bus. Let her go. It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It was delivered in a tone that belonged in a very different context, a tone that had been honed over 15 years of giving orders in situations where hesitation meant death, a tone that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the primal hindbrain that understands hierarchy and dominance and danger. Trevor and Curtis both turned. The entire bus turned, actually, because that voice had changed the frequency of the space, had shattered the pretense that everyone had been maintaining. Marcus stood in the aisle, one hand resting lightly on Titan's head. The dog stood beside him, alert but not aggressive, his training evident in every line of his posture. And here's what Trevor and Curtis saw. They saw a man in a military uniform. Sure, but the uniform didn't register as real to them. It registered as costume, as stolen valor, as some wannabe playing soldier. Because real Delta Force operators weren't on city buses. Real special forces didn't intervene in street crime. Real warriors didn't ride public transit. They had no idea who they were looking at. Curtis laughed. Actually laughed. Man, is this for real? You serious right now with this G.I. Joe shit? Trevor released Dorothy's wrist but stayed in the seat beside her, his body language shifting from predatory to mocking. Yo, Curtis, check it out. We got Captain America over here trying to save the day. That's cute, man. That's really cute. Marcus didn't respond. His face remained absolutely neutral, that mask of calm that comes from being in situations where emotional reactions get people killed. He took one step forward. Just one. But the quality of that movement, the way he carried his weight, the absolute certainty in it, that registered somewhere in Curtis's subconscious even if he wasn't consciously aware of it. Walk away, Marcus said. Same tone, same calm. Right now, while you still can. Curtis looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at Curtis, and in that moment of silent communication, they made their decision. They'd spent their entire lives in environments where backing down meant losing face, where retreat meant becoming prey yourself. And this guy, this fake soldier with his dog, he'd just challenged them in front of a bus full of witnesses. In front of the world. They couldn't walk away. Their entire identity depended on not walking away. "You know what?" Curtis said, reaching into his hoodie pocket. "I'm getting real tired of—" The knife came out fast. A folding blade, probably 4 inches. Nothing fancy, but more than enough to kill someone in close quarters. He held it low and loose, the way someone holds a knife when they've actually used one before, when it's a tool they understand. The entire bus gasped, that collective intake of breath that happens when violence stops being theoretical and becomes immediate and real. A woman near the front screamed. The bus driver, a heavyset man named Dennis, who'd been driving this route for 19 years, grabbed for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the button. Trevor stood up now, moving away from Dorothy and into the aisle beside Curtis, flanking Marcus from the left. His hand went into his own pocket, and while he didn't pull out a weapon, the implication was clear. 2 on 1. Armed, cornered prey fights back hardest. Marcus's expression didn't change, didn't shift even slightly. But something happened in his eyes, some fundamental alteration in the quality of his gaze, and Curtis felt it like a physical pressure, felt his certainty waver for the first time. "Last chance," Marcus said. And the thing about his voice in that moment was that it carried no anger, no fear, no excitement. It was the voice of someone delivering information, pure and simple. A weather report, a statement of fact. "Put the knife away. Get off the bus at the next stop. Walk away from this before it becomes something you can't walk away from." Curtis looked at the knife in his hand, looked at his partner, looked at the man in the uniform and the dog beside him, made his calculation, and chose wrong. "Man, screw this! I ain't getting punked by some—" He lunged forward, the knife coming up in a tight arc aimed at Marcus's midsection, a killing stroke if it landed. Fast, committed, the move of someone who'd been in knife fights before. Marcus moved, and here's where everything that happened in the next 4 seconds needs to be understood not as a sequence of events, but as a single fluid motion, the product of thousands of hours of training, of muscle memory so deep it bypassed conscious thought entirely. His left hand intercepted Curtis's knife wrist, not blocking it, but redirecting it, using the attacker's own momentum against him. Simultaneously, his right hand came up in a palm strike that connected with Curtis's jaw, snapping his head back. As Curtis staggered, Marcus maintained control of the knife arm, rotating it with a joint lock that forced Curtis to release the blade or have his elbow dislocated. The knife clattered to the floor. Marcus swept Curtis's legs, driving him face first into the metal pole that passengers held onto when standing. The impact was sickening. Curtis dropped like someone had cut his strings. Elapsed time, 1.8 seconds. Trevor, seeing his partner go down, reached into his pocket for whatever weapon he had there. He never got it out. Titan, responding to a hand signal so subtle most people wouldn't have even seen it, moved. 80 pounds of Belgian Malinois hit Trevor at knee height, jaws clamping onto his leg not to maim but to control, to bring him down. Trevor screamed, his hand coming out of his pocket empty as he tried to fight off the dog. Marcus was there in an instant, controlling Trevor's arms, forcing him face down onto the filthy bus floor, his knee in the small of Trevor's back, his weight distributed in a way that made resistance impossible without causing injury. Elapsed time, 3.6 seconds. Both attackers were down. Both were controlled. Neither was seriously injured, though Curtis was bleeding from where his face had connected with the pole, and Trevor was crying, actually crying, from the pain and the shock and the sudden understanding that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. The entire bus was dead silent. That profound silence that comes after violence, when the world has to recalibrate, when everyone's brain has to process what their eyes just witnessed. Marcus looked up at Dorothy. The elderly woman was still in her seat, still clutching her purse, her eyes wide with shock. "Mum," he said, his voice returning to that calm, gentle tone. "You're safe now. Are you hurt?" Dorothy shook her head, unable to speak. Marcus looked at the bus driver, who was frozen in his seat, the radio microphone still in his hand. "Sir, I need you to call this in. 2 suspects attempted robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. Tell them we need police response. Tell them the situation is contained. Can you do that for me?" Dennis nodded, his hands still shaking as he pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is bus 47. I need police response. We've got a situation. 2 suspects down. Contained. Corner of Negley and Ellsworth." Marcus maintained his position, his knee still in Trevor's back, his eyes scanning the rest of the bus, looking for additional threats, for Confederates, for anything else that didn't fit. This was the part that civilians never understood. The fight wasn't over just because the immediate threat was neutralized. The fight was over when he'd secured the environment, when he'd confirmed there were no other variables, when he could account for every person and every potential danger. Titan released Trevor's leg at another subtle hand signal and moved back to Marcus's side, sitting at perfect attention, his eyes on the 2 men on the ground. Not aggressive now, just watchful. Professional. A college student near the middle of the bus started recording on his phone. Then another. Within seconds, half the bus had their phones out, capturing the scene. Marcus made note of it but didn't try to stop them. The truth was on his side. The truth would be his best defense when the questions started. And the questions were going to start very soon. Marcus could already hear the sirens. The first police cruiser arrived in less than 3 minutes. Officer Janet Reeves and her partner, Officer Mike Chen, both with the Zone 5 station, came in hot with lights flashing but no siren. They'd been 2 blocks away when the call came through, and the dispatcher's voice had carried an edge of uncertainty. Bus incident. 2 suspects down. Contained. Witness reports of military personnel involved. None of it made sense until they pulled up alongside the bus and saw it through the windows. Janet was a 12-year veteran, had seen just about everything the East End could throw at her. But she'd never seen this. A man in full Delta Force uniform, standing in the aisle of a city bus, 2 suspects on the ground in front of him, a military working dog at his side. The other passengers pressed against the windows and walls like they were trying to melt into the upholstery. And an elderly woman clutching her purse, tears streaming down her face. "Control," Janet said into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline dump she was feeling. "We've got eyes on the scene, requesting backup and a supervisor. And someone needs to call Fort Indiantown Gap or wherever handles military police. This is beyond our pay grade." She and Mike entered through the front doors, hands on their weapons but not drawn. The tension on that bus was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every civilian eye was locked on them, with that desperate look people get when authority arrives and they can finally exhale, finally let someone else handle the crisis. Marcus saw them enter, kept his position, kept his knee in Trevor's back, kept his voice calm and clear. "Officers, my name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, U.S. Army Special Operations. These 2 suspects attempted to rob an elderly passenger. When I intervened, one of them pulled a knife and initiated an assault. Both suspects are secured. The weapon is on the floor approximately 6 feet behind me. No shots were fired. No civilians were harmed." Janet blinked. In her 12 years, she'd taken hundreds of witness statements. She'd never heard one delivered like a military after-action report, precise and complete, anticipating every question she would have asked. "Sir, I need you to step away from the suspects," she said, her hand still on her weapon. Not because she thought this uniformed soldier was a threat, but because protocol was protocol, and she had no idea what she was walking into. Marcus nodded once. Understood. I'm going to stand up slowly. My dog is trained to stay unless commanded otherwise. He will not be a threat to you. He rose smoothly, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. Trevor immediately tried to scramble away, gasping for breath now that the weight was off his back. Mike moved in quickly with handcuffs, securing both suspects while Janet kept her attention on Marcus. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. Marcus reached slowly into his uniform pocket and produced a military ID card, the kind with multiple security features and a photo that matched the face in front of her exactly. Janet examined it under the bus's fluorescent lights. Marcus James Hale, Staff Sergeant, born April 15, 1989. The ID showed his unit designation, though the specific details were redacted in a way that suggested classification levels she didn't have clearance to see. Is this real? She asked, and immediately felt stupid for asking. Of course it was real, but the whole situation felt surreal, like someone had dropped a piece of Afghanistan into the middle of a Pittsburgh city bus. Yes, ma'am, Marcus replied. By now, Curtis had recovered enough to start talking. His face was swelling where it had connected with the pole, his words coming out slurred. Man, that's bullshit. He attacked us. We were just sitting here and he went crazy. That dog attacked me for no reason. Trevor, now in handcuffs beside his partner, found his voice too. The fear had transformed into defensive aggression, the way it does when people realize they're caught. For real, this is excessive force or whatever. We didn't do nothing. He just came at us. That's assault. Dorothy Cassidy, still in her seat but steadier now, made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. That's a lie. That's a damned lie, and everyone on this bus knows it. And here's where something beautiful happened. Something that restored a little bit of your faith in humanity. Because all those passengers, all those people who'd been looking at their phones, pretending not to notice when an elderly woman was being terrorized, they found their voices now. They found their courage after the danger had passed. A nurse in scrubs stood up, her voice sharp with indignation. Officer, I saw the whole thing. Those two were robbing that woman. The soldier tried to stop them verbally, and one of them pulled a knife. The college kid who'd been recording held up his phone. I got most of it on video. You want me to send it to you? I got the knife, the attack, everything. A construction worker near the back called out. That man saved her. Those two punks got exactly what they deserved. Janet looked at Mike. Mike looked at Janet. They'd both been in situations where witness accounts contradicted each other, where everyone had a different version of events. This wasn't one of those situations. This was a bus full of people telling the exact same story, backing it up with video evidence and looking at Marcus Hale like he'd personally descended from heaven to deliver justice. All right, Janet said, making a decision. Chen, get those two into the cruiser. I want them separated. We'll transport them to the station and sort this out there. As Mike led the handcuffed suspects off the bus, Trevor was still talking, still trying to spin the narrative. This ain't over, man. My lawyer's going to destroy you. You can't just attack people because you got a uniform on. Marcus didn't respond, didn't even look at him. His attention was on Dorothy, who was still sitting in her seat, still clutching her purse like it was the only solid thing in the universe. He walked over to her, Titan following at his heel. He knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Ma'am, my name is Marcus. Are you sure you're not hurt? Do you need medical attention? Dorothy looked at this young man in his uniform, at the kind eyes that had just seconds ago been delivering calculated violence, and something broke open in her chest. I'm okay. I'm okay because of you. They were going to take my purse. My husband's ring is in there. He passed 3 years ago, and I was taking his ring to have it resized for my grandson, and they were going to take it. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Marcus did something that wasn't in any military manual. He took her hand, the one that wasn't clutching the purse, and held it gently. "They didn't take it. You kept it safe. You were brave." "I was terrified," Dorothy said, tears flowing freely now. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," Marcus said quietly. "It's acting in spite of it. You held on to what mattered to you. That's brave." By now 3 more police cruisers had arrived, along with a supervisor's vehicle. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stepped onto the bus, and you could feel the shift in energy immediately. She was a 23-year veteran, a woman who'd earned her rank through competence and a reputation for not taking anyone's nonsense. She took one look at the scene, at the uniformed soldier comforting an elderly victim, at the dozen civilians all talking at once, at the military working dog sitting at perfect attention, and understood that this situation required a different approach than the standard incident protocol. "Everyone, I need you to calm down," she said, her voice carrying natural authority. "We're going to take statements from each of you, and you'll all be free to go. Officer Reeves, what's the situation?" Janet gave her a quick rundown. Attempted robbery, armed assault, intervention by military personnel, multiple witnesses, video evidence, suspects in custody. Sarah turned to Marcus, who had stood when she entered, coming to a position of attention that was so ingrained he probably didn't even realize he was doing it. "Staff Sergeant Hale, I'm Lieutenant Martinez. I need you to come with me to the station so we can get a full statement. You're not under arrest or being detained, but I'm sure you understand we need to document this properly." "Yes, ma'am, I understand completely." "Is that a military working dog?" "Yes, ma'am. His name is Titan. He's with me." Sarah nodded. "He can come. God knows we've got enough space at the station." She paused, looking at Marcus more carefully, at the specific patches on his uniform, at the way he carried himself. She'd been a military police officer before joining Pittsburgh PD, had spent 4 years at Fort Bragg. She knew what she was looking at, even if the specifics were above her clearance level. "Staff Sergeant, off the record, thank you for what you did here, but this is going to generate a lot of paperwork, and probably some attention you don't want." "I understand, ma'am." The trip to the Zone 5 station took 15 minutes. Marcus rode in the back of Sarah's cruiser, Titan on the seat beside him. Sarah didn't turn on the lights or siren. This wasn't an arrest. This was just transportation. Through the cage separating the front and back seats, she asked questions. Casual questions. Where was he based? How long had he been in? How many deployments? Marcus answered the ones he could. Fort Bragg. 15 years. The number of deployments was classified, but enough that he'd lost count of the number of times he'd said goodbye to his family without knowing if he'd come back. "You got family in Pittsburgh?" Sarah asked. "My sister. She lives in Shadyside. I was heading there after the ceremony at the VA." "The ceremony?" "Memorial service, for fallen members of my unit." Sarah went quiet after that. Some questions didn't need follow-ups. The Zone 5 station was a concrete and glass building that had been built in the 1970s and showed every year of its age. Inside, it smelled like every police station in America. Burnt coffee, industrial cleaner, and the particular funk of human desperation. They put Marcus in interview room 2, a windowless box with a metal table, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. "Can I get you anything?" Sarah asked. "Coffee? Water?" "Water would be good, ma'am. And maybe something for Titan. A bowl of water if you have one." 10 minutes later, Marcus was giving his statement to Detective Robert Kern, a homicide detective who'd been pulled into this because assault with a deadly weapon technically fell under his jurisdiction. Kern was in his 50s, with the weary eyes of a man who'd seen humanity at its worst for 3 decades. He listened to Marcus's account without interrupting, taking notes in a battered notebook that looked like it had survived multiple coffee spills and at least 1 flood. So let me make sure I have this straight," Kern said when Marcus finished. "You gave them multiple opportunities to disengage. You warned them verbally. You only engaged physically when one of them produced a weapon and initiated an attack. And your goal throughout was to neutralize the threat with minimum force necessary to protect the victim and secure the suspects." "That's correct, sir." Kern tapped his pen against his notebook. "Staff Sergeant, I've been doing this a long time. Most people, when they're involved in a violent encounter, their recollection is fragmented, confused. They remember feelings more than facts. You just gave me a statement that reads like a tactical after-action report. Every detail, every timeline, every decision point clearly articulated." "That's my training, sir." "Yeah." Kern leaned back in his chair. "What unit did you say you were with?" "1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta." Kern blinked. "Your Delta Force?" "Yes, sir." "Jesus Christ." Kern ran a hand over his face. Okay, that explains a lot." He looked at the camera in the corner, knowing this was being recorded, knowing this would be reviewed by people above his pay grade. "For the record, based on the witness statements, the video evidence, and your account, I see no indication that you acted inappropriately. You intervened to stop a violent felony in progress, you responded with proportional force when attacked with a deadly weapon, and you secured the suspects without causing unnecessary injury. In my professional opinion, this was a justified use of force in defense of another person." Marcus nodded, but his face remained neutral. He knew this wasn't over. It was never this simple, and he was right. While Marcus was giving his statement, Lieutenant Martinez was in her office making phone calls. The first was to her captain, explaining the situation. The second was to the Military Police Liaison Office at Fort Indian Town Gap. The third, after being transferred twice and being told to hold multiple times, was to someone at Joint Special Operations Command who didn't give his name but listened very carefully to everything she said. "Lieutenant Martinez," the nameless voice said, "I need you to understand something. Staff Sergeant Hale is one of our most decorated operators. He's been involved in operations that have saved American lives and prevented terrorist attacks. He's also on mandatory leave pending psychological evaluation after a difficult deployment. The fact that he's in Pittsburgh, wearing his uniform on public transit, suggests he was returning from some kind of official function. What I'm telling you is that this man is legitimate. His presence there was legitimate, and his actions will be consistent with his training." "I understand," Sarah said. "But I need to know if there are any complications from your end. Is he AWOL? Is there any reason he shouldn't have been where he was?" "No complications. He's exactly where he's supposed to be. On leave. Visiting family. We'll need copies of all reports for our records, but from our perspective, he's a service member who intervened in a civilian crime. We're not going to interfere with your investigation, but we are going to monitor it." Which was military speak for, "Don't screw this up, or you'll have federal attention you don't want." An hour after arriving at the station, Marcus was released. Not charged with anything, not even technically detained anymore. He was free to go, though they asked him to remain available for follow-up questions if needed. Detective Kern walked him out personally, all the way to the front entrance. "Staff Sergeant," Kern said as they reached the doors. "Those 2 suspects you put down, we ran their names. Curtis Lamont and Trevor Bridges. Both have priors. Robbery, assault, drug charges. Curtis did 18 months at SCI Forest for aggravated assault 3 years ago. They're not good people." "No one is purely good or purely bad, sir," Marcus said quietly. "They made bad choices. They'll face the consequences." "That's a generous way to look at it." Kern extended his hand. "Thank you for what you did. For that woman. For all the people on that bus who were too scared to act. We need more people willing to stand up." Marcus shook his hand. "I just did what needed doing." Outside the station, the early evening air was cool and clean. Titan stretched, clearly happy to be out of the building. Marcus pulled out his phone, which had been on silent mode, and saw 17 missed calls. 6 from his sister Rachel. 3 from numbers he didn't recognize. 8 from a number he did recognize, one that made his stomach sink. His commanding officer. He called Rachel first. She answered on the first ring, her voice pitched high with worry. "Marcus, oh my God, are you okay? It's all over the news. It's on social media. Someone posted a video and it's going viral. Mom called me freaking out. Are you hurt? Where are you?" "I'm fine, Rachel. I'm at the Zone 5 police station. I'm about to get a ride to your place. I'll explain everything when I get there." "The news is saying you took down 2 armed men on a bus. They're saying you're a hero." Marcus closed his eyes. "I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly what a hero would say." He ended the call with his sister and looked at Titan. "Well, buddy, I guess we're famous now. That's exactly what we needed, right?" Titan tilted his head, his expression seeming to say, "When has anything ever been simple?" Marcus called his commanding officer next. Colonel David Hastings answered immediately. "Hale, please tell me you didn't start an international incident on a Pittsburgh city bus." "No, sir. Just a domestic incident. Very domestic. Very small scale." "I've had 3 different people call me in the last hour. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office is asking questions. CNN is asking for comment. Do you understand that you're trending on Twitter? Do you even know what Twitter is?" "I've heard of it, sir. Video of you taking down 2 suspects is at 4 million views and climbing. The hashtag is #DeltaForce on a bus. I can't make this up." Marcus felt a headache building behind his eyes. "Sir, I was just trying to get to my sister's house." I know you were." Hastings's voice softened slightly. "I read the police report. You did everything by the book. You gave them chances to walk away. You only engaged when threatened. You protected civilians. This is going to be fine, Marcus. But you need to understand that you're about to become a very public face of something. The Army's going to want to use this. They're going to want you to do interviews, to talk about service, to be a symbol." "I don't want to be a symbol, sir. I want to be left alone." "I understand that, and I'm going to protect you as much as I can. But this is bigger than what you want now. You stepped into the light. You can't step back into the shadow." The conversation ended with Hastings promising to run interference with the media relations people, to buy Marcus some time before he'd have to make any decisions about going public. But both men knew the truth. The video was out there. The story was out there. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, Delta Force. Operator, defending an elderly woman on a city bus with his military working dog. It was the kind of story that the country was hungry for, the kind of narrative that cut through all the noise and division and reminded people that there were still warriors who stood between the innocent and the predators. A patrol car gave Marcus and Titan a ride to Rachel's house in Shadyside. It was a narrow brick row house on a tree-lined street, the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and kids still played in the yards. Rachel met him at the door, throwing her arms around him before he'd even made it up the front steps. "You scared me," she whispered into his shoulder. "When I saw the video, when I saw that man pull a knife on you, I thought—" "I'm okay, Rach, I promise. It looked worse than it was." She pulled back, looking up at him with eyes that held their mother's worry and their father's skepticism. "Marcus, you were outnumbered. They had a weapon. How is that not as bad as it looked?" "Because I've faced worse in places you've never heard of, with stakes you couldn't imagine." Marcus thought, but what he said was, "Because I had training, because I had Titan, because I knew what I was doing." Inside, Rachel's husband Tom was already pulling up the video on his laptop. The local news was running it on a loop. Someone had stabilized the footage, had zoomed in on the key moments. You could see everything. The knife coming out, Marcus moving, the precise, controlled violence, Titan taking down Trevor with surgical efficiency. All of it set to breathless commentary from news anchors who'd probably never been in a real fight in their lives. "Dude," Tom said, shaking his head in amazement, "you're like Jason Bourne or something. That was the most badass thing I've ever seen." "It wasn't badass," Marcus said quietly. "It was necessary. There's a difference." But as he sat on his sister's couch, as he watched the video play again and again, as he saw the comments scrolling by, thousands of strangers weighing in on the 30 seconds that were going to define him in the public consciousness, Marcus understood that the difference didn't matter. Not to them. Not to the world that was about to demand pieces of him he wasn't sure he had left to give. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. He opened it, expecting another media request. Instead, it was a message from Dorothy Cassidy. Rachel had apparently given her his contact information. "Dear Marcus, I don't have the words to properly thank you for what you did today. You saved more than my purse. You saved my faith that good people still exist in this world. My grandson will wear his grandfather's ring because you were brave enough to stand when others sat. God bless you and keep you safe. Dorothy." Marcus read the message 3 times. Then he put his phone down, dropped his head into his hands, and for the first time since the incident, allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened. Not the physical confrontation. He'd been in 1,000 situations more dangerous than 2 street thugs with a knife. But the exposure, the attention, the loss of anonymity that he'd relied on to move through the world unnoticed. Titan rested his head on Marcus's knee, those dark, intelligent eyes looking up at him with perfect understanding. The dog had seen him in war zones, had watched him make impossible decisions, had been there for the nightmares that still came on the bad nights. And now he was here, a solid, warm presence that asked nothing and gave everything. "Good boy," Marcus whispered, scratching behind Titan's ears. "Good boy." Outside, the sun was setting over Pittsburgh, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more attention, more demands. But tonight, in his sister's house, with his dog beside him and a grateful elderly woman's message on his phone, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something that mattered, something that was worth the cost of the spotlight he'd just stepped into, something that reminded him why he wore the uniform in the first place. The video hit 5 million views by midnight. By the next morning, it had crossed 12 million. The algorithm had done its work, pushing the footage across every platform, every feed, every corner of the digital world where people congregated to witness moments of raw, unfiltered reality. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale and Titan had become an overnight sensation, a story that transcended the usual tribal divides that separated people into their respective camps. Conservatives loved it because it was a military hero defending traditional values. Liberals loved it because it was someone standing up for a vulnerable elderly woman. Everyone loved it because in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and unsafe, here was 30 seconds of absolute moral clarity. But here's what most people watching that video didn't know, what they couldn't see in those grainy cell phone images. Curtis Lamont and Trevor Bridges, the 2 men now sitting in the Allegheny County Jail awaiting arraignment, they weren't just opportunistic street criminals. They were part of something bigger, something that had been growing in the shadows of Pittsburgh's East End for the better part of 2 years. Detective Robert Kern realized it first. He'd gone home after interviewing Marcus, had eaten a microwave dinner alone in his apartment, like he did most nights since his divorce, and had been scrolling through his case files when something clicked. He pulled up the reports from the last 6 months. 11 robberies on city buses. Always the same routes, always the same MO. Elderly victims, immigrants, people who looked vulnerable and unlikely to fight back. Small amounts of cash, Phones, jewelry, nothing big enough to trigger a major investigation, just enough to stay under the radar. He cross-referenced the arrest. Records for Curtis and Trevor. Both had been picked up twice before on similar charges. Both times the charges had been reduced or dropped entirely. Witnesses had recanted. Evidence had disappeared. They'd walked away with nothing more than probation violations, which meant someone had been running interference for them. Someone with access to the system. Someone who could make problems disappear. At 6:47 a.m., Kern was back at his desk, 3 cups of coffee deep, when he got the call that changed everything. It was from Agent Lisa Morrison with the FBI's Pittsburgh field office. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Detective Kern, I understand you're the primary on the bus incident from yesterday, the one with the Delta Force operator. That's correct. I need you to not charge those suspects yet. I need you to hold them for 48 hours while we execute some warrants. Can you do that? Kern sat up straighter. What's going on? How much do you know about the East End? Transit crew? Never heard of them. That's because they're good at staying invisible. We've been investigating them for 8 months. They're a criminal enterprise that's been running protection rackets, drug distribution, and systematic robbery operations targeting immigrant communities and elderly populations. They use the bus system as their hunting ground because it's public, because victims are isolated, because nobody thinks to look at public transit as an organized crime venue. Your 2 suspects, they're foot soldiers. But their arrest yesterday, the public attention it's getting, it spooked the leadership. We've got wiretaps. They're moving assets, destroying evidence, trying to shut down operations before we can roll them up. Kern felt his pulse quicken. You're telling me that soldier stumbled into the middle of an FBI investigation. I'm telling you that soldier just gave us the probable cause we needed to accelerate our timeline. Those 2 suspects are going to flip. We're offering them a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. And when they flip, we're going to bring down an organization that's been terrorizing vulnerable people for 2 years. By noon, the story had evolved. What had started as a viral video of a military hero was now developing into something more complex. Local news stations were reporting that the FBI had executed warrants at 4 locations across the East End. 7 additional arrests had been made. Sources were saying this was connected to a larger criminal enterprise, and that the 2 men who'd attacked the elderly woman on the bus were part of an organized crew. Marcus watched the news coverage from Rachel's living room, Titan asleep at his feet. He felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that the investigation was expanding beyond just his actions. Concern about the scope of what he'd apparently stumbled into. And a growing frustration with the way the media was framing him as some kind of vigilante hero, rather than just a man who'd done what needed doing. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Against his better judgment, he answered. Staff Sergeant Hale. The voice was male, older, with the refined diction of someone who'd spent a lifetime in education or law. Speaking. My name is Dr. Raymond Foster. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. I've been studying the phenomenon of the bystander effect, the psychological mechanisms that prevent people from intervening when they witness crimes or emergencies. Your actions yesterday represent a perfect counterexample to the research. I was wondering if you'd be willing to participate in a study to help us understand what factors enable some individuals to overcome the social paralysis that typically prevents intervention. Marcus closed his eyes. Sir, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in being studied. I understand, but please consider this. There were 23 other people on that bus, 23 people who watched an elderly woman being victimized and did nothing until you acted. Understanding why you were different, what enabled you to move when others froze, that knowledge could help us train people to be more like you, to stand up, to intervene, to protect the vulnerable. I'm not different, Marcus said quietly. I just had training that most people don't have. I had a dog that most people don't have. And I had 15 years of experience making life and death decisions under pressure. That's not a psychological profile. That's just preparation meeting opportunity. But don't you see? That's exactly the point. Preparation can be taught. Courage can be cultivated. Your actions yesterday have already inspired thousands of people. Imagine if we could understand and replicate the factors that made you willing to act. Marcus ended the call politely but firmly. He wasn't interested in being anyone's case study. But the professor's words lingered. 23 other people. All of them with eyes and ears and moral compasses. All of them watching an elderly woman being terrorized. And all of them frozen by some combination of fear, uncertainty, and the assumption that someone else would do something. That afternoon, Dorothy Cassidy gave an interview to KDKA, the local CBS affiliate. She sat in her small, neat living room, wearing her best dress, her grandson's resized ring now on a chain around her neck. The interviewer, a young woman named Jessica Park, handled her with gentleness. "Mrs. Cassidy, can you walk us through what happened on that bus?" Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice was clear. "Those two young men, they cornered me. One of them sat next to me so I couldn't get out. The other stood in front of me, blocking me in. They wanted my purse. And I know it sounds foolish, but my late husband's wedding ring was in that purse. I was taking it to be resized for my grandson. I couldn't let them have it." "What were you feeling in that moment?" "Terrified, alone. I looked around that bus and everyone was looking away. Everyone was pretending it wasn't happening. And I understood. I did. People were scared. But it made me feel so isolated, like I didn't matter enough for anyone to risk themselves." And then Staff Sergeant Hale intervened. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. He stood up. This man I'd never met, who had no obligation to me, he stood up. And his voice, when he told them to let me go, it wasn't angry or aggressive. It was just absolutely certain, like there was no universe where he was going to allow them to hurt me. "When they pulled the knife, were you afraid for him?" "Of course I was. But you know what I saw in that moment? I saw someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't being reckless. He was being professional. And his dog, that beautiful dog, they moved together like they were one being. It was over so fast I barely understood what had happened. And then he came over to me, and he knelt down, and he made sure I was okay. He held my hand. This warrior who had just fought off 2 armed men, he held my hand and told me I was brave." The interview went viral in its own right. Dorothy Cassidy became the human face of the story, the grandmother everyone wished they had, the vulnerable person who reminded viewers why intervention mattered. Her gratitude was genuine and profound, and it shifted the narrative. This wasn't just about a soldier being heroic. This was about what happens when one person decides that another person's safety matters more than their own comfort. 3 days after the incident, Marcus received a formal request from the mayor's office. They wanted to honor him at a city council meeting. Give him a commendation, take photos for the papers, turn him into a symbol of Pittsburgh's values. He declined politely but firmly. He'd done what he was trained to do. He didn't need recognition for it. But Curtis Lamont and Trevor Bridges, sitting in separate cells in the county jail, they were having very different conversations. The FBI had made their offer. Full cooperation, including testimony against the leadership of the East End Transit crew, in exchange for reduced charges and possible placement in witness protection. Curtis took the deal first. Once he started talking, he couldn't stop. He detailed 2 years of operations. Named names, drew maps, explained how they'd recruited vulnerable young men from the neighborhoods, how they'd targeted specific bus routes where enforcement was lax, how they'd been protected by a network that included a corrupt transit police officer and a county clerk who'd been feeding them information about witness statements and investigations. The scope of it was staggering. The East End Transit crew had been responsible for over 300 crimes in 2 years, Robberies, assaults, drug distribution, intimidation. They'd operated with near impunity because they'd been smart about it. Small crimes, vulnerable victims, and institutional protection that made prosecution nearly impossible. Until a Delta Force operator and his dog had stepped into their operation and torn it apart in 4 seconds. The final arrest came on a Thursday morning. The leader of the crew, a man named Darius Kent, was taken into custody at his home in Homewood. He was 34 years old, had no official employment, and owned 2 houses, 3 cars, and had $87,000 in cash hidden in his basement. The FBI seized it all, and more importantly, they seized his phones, his computers, his records, the evidence that would dismantle his entire operation. At the press conference announcing the arrests, FBI Special Agent in Charge Morrison stood at a podium, flanked by Pittsburgh's police chief and the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. She was careful with her words, but the message was clear. For 2 years, a criminal enterprise has been preying on the most vulnerable members of our community. Elderly citizens, recent immigrants, people who rely on public transportation because they have no other options. These criminals believed they could operate with impunity. They believed no one would stop them. They were wrong. A reporter called out from the crowd, "Is it true that this investigation was accelerated because of the incident on the bus last week, the one with the soldier?" Morrison didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. Staff Sergeant Hale's intervention on that bus provided us with the probable cause we needed to execute warrants that had been prepared for weeks. His actions and the public attention they generated forced this organization to make mistakes. They panicked. They started destroying evidence and moving assets, and that gave us the opening we needed. So he's responsible for bringing down this crew? He's responsible for protecting an innocent woman. We're responsible for bringing down the crew. But yes, his courage was a catalyst. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away. That evening, Marcus finally agreed to meet with Dorothy Cassidy again. She'd asked to see him, to properly thank him, and Rachel had convinced him that he owed her that much. They met at a small coffee shop in Bloomfield, neutral territory, away from cameras and reporters. Dorothy arrived with her daughter and her grandson, a shy 10-year-old boy named Daniel. The boy stared at Titan with a mixture of awe and nervousness. "He's very friendly," Marcus assured him. "He only acts aggressive when he's protecting someone. Right now, he's just a dog who likes kids and ear scratches." Daniel tentatively reached out and touched Titan's head. The dog's tail wagged, and some of the tension left the boy's shoulders. Dorothy reached across the table and took Marcus's hand. "I've been thinking about what I want to say to you. I've practiced it dozens times. But now that we're here, all I can think is thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for not looking away. Thank you for reminding me that there are still good men in this world. Mrs. Cassidy, I didn't do anything that anyone else couldn't have done. But they didn't do it. That's the point. You did." They talked for an hour, about her late husband, who'd been a Korean War veteran, about Marcus's service, the parts he could talk about Titan and the bond between a soldier and his dog, about the weight of wearing a uniform and what it means to live up to an ideal. As they were leaving, young Daniel tugged on Marcus's sleeve. "Are you a superhero?" Marcus knelt down to the boy's level. "No, buddy, I'm not. Superheroes have powers. I just have training. But you know what? Anyone can be trained. Anyone can learn to be brave. Anyone can decide that protecting others matters more than protecting themselves. That's not a superpower. That's just a choice. Can I be like you when I grow up?" Marcus looked at Dorothy, then back at the boy. "You can be better than me. You can be the kind of man who never needs to use violence because you've built a world where people look out for each other, where 23 people don't sit silent when one person needs help. That's the real heroism. Not fighting, caring." Walking back to Rachel's house later, Titan trotting beside him, Marcus felt the weight of the last few days beginning to lift. The arrests had been made. The organization had been dismantled. Dorothy was safe. The story would fade eventually, replaced by the next viral moment, the next controversy, the next distraction. But something had changed in him too. He'd come to Pittsburgh seeking peace, seeking a break from the weight of his service, seeking a few weeks where he could pretend the world was safe and simple. Instead, he'd been reminded that the world was neither safe nor simple. That threats existed everywhere, not just in the deserts and mountains where he'd spent his career, and that the choice to act or not act was one we all faced every single day. His phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Hastings. "Media requests have died down. You're clear to finish your leave in peace. Well done, Hale. You represented us well." Marcus typed back a simple response. "Thank you, sir." Titan looked up at him, those intelligent eyes seeming to ask a question. Marcus scratched behind the dog's ears. "Yeah, buddy. I think we're done being famous. Back to being invisible now, just the way we like it." But as they walked through the streets of Pittsburgh, as evening fell and the city lights began to glow against the darkening sky, Marcus noticed something. People recognized him. They didn't approach, didn't make a fuss, but they nodded, made eye contact, acknowledged him. And in those brief moments of recognition, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not admiration, not hero worship, but something simpler and more profound. Hope. They saw in him a reminder that the world still contained people who would stand between the innocent and the predators. That courage still existed. That decency still mattered. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth the cost of being seen. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that one person's courage can change everything, we'd be honored if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us about a time when someone stood up for you, or when you found the courage to stand up for someone else. Hit subscribe, because we're building a community that believes in these stories, that believes in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And here's what I want you to remember. Marcus Hale isn't a superhero. Titan isn't a fantasy. They're real. They're the people and the partners who walk among us every day, carrying burdens we can't see, prepared for battles we hope never come. The question isn't whether heroes exist. The question is whether we'll recognize them when they're standing right in front of us, whether we'll support them, whether we'll learn from them, whether we'll become them when our moment comes. Because that moment will come. For all of us. The moment when we have to choose between looking away and standing up, between silence and action, between comfort and courage, and what you decide in that moment will define not just who you are, but what kind of world we're building together. Type Amen in the comments if you believe that good still triumphs. That courage still matters. That 23 people might sit silent, but it only takes one to change everything. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And may you have the strength to be that one when your moment comes.